She didn't ask for help. Not when her wheelchair got stuck in the gravel. Not when her twin girls clung to her coat as they were cast out with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. And certainly not when a quiet single dad pulled over in a dusty truck offering them a ride. And something far more dangerous. A second chance. Before we begin, if you believe in the quiet power of kindness, in stories where love shows up when it's least expected, and in miracles disguised as ordinary moments, consider subscribing. These are the stories that just might restore your faith in people, and maybe even yourself. Now let me take you back to the road where their lives collided, and everything quietly changed. The last streaks of sun bled out over the Montana horizon, brushing gold across the wheat fields and the cracked blacktop. Jake Rowan pulled his dusty Chevy pickup into the gas station, the kind that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Reagan administration. He killed the engine side into the silence and rubbed the back of his neck. It had been a long day of wrenching tractors and hauling scrap metal out of the Cooley Ranch yard. His son Cassian was likely home by now, microwaving something questionable and blasting Johnny Cash through the walls of their old farmhouse. Jake smiled at the thought. As he stepped out of the truck, the faint sound of yelling cut through the still air. It came from the far side of the lot, where a dark green SUV was parked half off the asphalt. Front tire deflated back hatch cracked open. Near it stood a man in his 60s, tall and square-jawed, dressed too fine for a place like this. His face was twisted in scorn as he flung a worn suitcase onto the gravel. At his feet sat a woman in a wheelchair. She had soft, sunken eyes and wind-blown brown hair that curled at the ends. Her hands gripped the chair's armrests, knuckles white. Beside her stood two little girls, twins maybe 7 years old, holding hands and staring at the ground. They looked like they'd been holding their breath for hours. "You're not my problem anymore, Isolde," the man spat. "You made your choices. Now live with them." "Dad, please." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No. I've done enough," he barked, turning. "You want to teach your daughters about independence? Start here." He got in the car and drove off without another word. Jake didn't move for a long second. Then his boots crunched gravel as he crossed the lot toward the woman and the girls. None of them looked up. The woman had tears on her cheeks. One of the girls was trembling. Jake crouched, slowly lowering himself to her eye level. "Ma'am," he said gently. "Are you all right?" She looked at him startled. Her eyes were too tired for fear. "I will be fine," she said quickly. "We just need to rest a little." He noticed the cardboard sign wedged between the suitcase and a diaper bag. "Please don't call anyone. We just need somewhere warm." Jake glanced back at his truck, then at the woman again. "My name's Jake Rowan," he said. "I live about 15 miles east of here. Got a house. Small but warm. I got a son. He's good with kids. I don't know what's going on and I'm not asking. But I've got an empty room and supper on the stove." She blinked, lips parting. Why she asked. He shrugged. "You look like someone who's had enough doors closed today." I figured, maybe one should open. The girls looked up now. One had a tear-streaked face and a crooked ponytail. The other clutched a small stuffed rabbit to her chest, like it was the only solid thing left in her world. The woman hesitated, then nodded once slowly. The ride was quiet. Jake turned the heat up in the truck. The girls, Lyra and Junie, as he learned, curled up in the back seat under a flannel blanket Jake kept for hunting trips. Isolde sat beside him, still as stone, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Your husband?" he asked softly, eyes still on the road. "Died 3 years ago," she replied. "He was their son." Jake didn't ask more. The pieces were coming together without words. 15 miles of gravel and dusk. Later, the truck turned up a long drive lined with pines and sagging fence posts. Jake's house stood plain and sturdy, 2 stories of chipped paint and warm windows. A porch swing creaked in the breeze. Cassian was on the porch, holding a plate of something microwaved and unidentifiable. He raised an eyebrow at the guests. Jake gave a tight smile. "We've got company." That night, Jake sat alone at the kitchen table long after the girls had been tucked into spare cots, and Isolde had been wheeled into the sunroom with clean blankets. Cassian had gone upstairs, headphones on. Jake stared at the empty teacup in front of him, thinking about kindness, about how hard it had been to find when he'd needed it most, and how easy it was to forget it could still change things. The door to the sunroom creaked. Isolde's chair rolled quietly in. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "You didn't have to. But you did." Jake looked up. Her eyes were clearer now. Less like shattered glass, more like quiet water. "Everyone deserves a place to land," he said. "Even if it's just for the night." She smiled faintly. And in that moment, something shifted. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a small, quiet click. The kind that happens when two broken things recognize each other and decide not to be broken alone. The sun rose quietly over the pines behind Jake's farmhouse, painting the walls of the old sunroom in soft amber light. Isolde opened her eyes slowly, the stiffness in her back reminding her she hadn't slept on anything but couch cushions in weeks. Or had it been months? Outside the window she could see fields coated in morning frost, and a sagging barn in need of a good coat of paint. There was a fence, half-finished, leaning like it had given up halfway through a story. She listened for her daughters. Nothing. Panic stirred in her chest, sudden and sharp. She threw off the quilt and pushed the wheels of her chair forward, still clumsy, her palms raw from use. She found them in the kitchen. Jake was at the stove, flipping something in a cast-iron pan. The girl sat at the table, Junie whispering something into her sister's ear, making Lyra smile for the first time in days. Cassian sat across from them, head buried in a book, a carton of orange juice between his elbow and a screwdriver. Isolde froze in the doorway, uncertain whether to feel relieved or out of place. Jake turned. "Morning," he said simply, as though it had been years, not hours, since they met. "I'm sorry," she began, gripping the doorframe. "I should have—" "You're right on time," he interrupted gently. "We were just arguing about whether these are actual pancakes or just hot sponges in disguise." Junie giggled. He added, "You get the tie-breaking vote." They ate in a quiet that didn't feel forced. Jake passed syrup like it was currency, while Cassian nodded politely, but remained largely quiet. The boy had his father's jaw, and his mother's eyes soft around the edges, but wary. He watched Isolde and the girls with a mix of curiosity and guarded distance. After breakfast, Jake led the girls to the barn to show them the goats. Cassian helped them into coats, too big for their arms. Isolde remained inside, wheels squeaking softly across the old wooden floors. The house smelled like cedar and sun-dried laundry. Every creak, every worn corner told the story of a life that had been patched and rebuilt more than once. She found the bookshelf in the living room. It was covered in dust, but not neglect, just time. Books were double-stacked, well-thumbed, full of paper clips and underlines. Her fingers moved over the spines like a blind woman reading Braille. Robert Frost, Steinbeck, Dickinson. She hadn't touched poetry since the accident. Words had once been her sanctuary, before they became knives, reminding her of the life she no longer lived. "You can borrow any of them," Jake said suddenly behind her. "Most folks don't. Cass likes manuals. I prefer stories." Isolde flinched slightly, then nodded. "I used to teach literature," she said. Jake smiled faintly. "I figured." "How?" He motioned to her fingertips. "You trace titles like someone who used to know how they end." That afternoon, while the girls napped in Cassian's old bunk beds, Jake showed Isolde the old garden plot. It had been overrun with weeds and gilt, but the bones were still there, framed with chicken wire and stubborn roots. "I was going to till it this spring," Jake said, kicking at the edge. "Never got around to it." Isolde wheeled closer, her fingers resting on the spokes of her wheels. "Do you mind if I try?" she asked. Jake turned to her, surprised. "You want a garden?" She gave a small shrug. "I can't do much, but I can still dig." He nodded. "Then it's yours." It was the first thing anyone had given her that wasn't out of pity in a very long time. That night, as Jake cleaned up the dishes and Cassian disappeared with his homework, Isolde sat near the fireplace. She watched the flames curl like old memories, flickering and stubborn. The twins played quietly on the floor nearby. Junie stacked toy blocks from a bin Jake had dug out of the attic. Lyra was drawing slow, careful lines on yellowed paper tongue tucked into her cheek. Isolde looked at Jake. "Your wife?" Jake set down a mug of tea before answering. "Marcy," he said. "She passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer. Took her fast. I'm sorry." He nodded. "So am I." They didn't say more. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just two people watching their own ghosts pass quietly between the floorboards. Isolde whispered, "I was a ghost for so long, I forgot how to be anything else." Jake turned to her, voice low. "Well, welcome back." She smiled for real this time. As the fire died down, Jake picked up Lyra's drawing from the floor. It was a picture of the house. But not just the house, the garden blooming with sunflowers. Cassian holding hands with both twins. Isolde smiling from her chair with color in her cheeks. And Jake, taller than everyone, standing behind them, a hand on Isolde's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The next morning the frost had retreated, leaving behind muddy footprints of spring that clung to the edges of Jake's fields. The air smelled of wet soil and firewood, and the sky stretched wide and cloudless above the Montana pines. Isolde sat beside the old garden plot, gloves loose on her lap, a small trowel resting in her lap like a promise. The wheelchair tires had sunk slightly into the softened earth, but she didn't mind. She hadn't been this close to a garden in years. It wasn't much to look at, just a square of earth, laced with dead vines and thistles. But beneath it, Isolde could feel something alive. Something waiting. Jake had left a stack of old tools beside her, along with a tray of seed packets, carrots, sunflowers, sugar snap peas. He hadn't said much, just offered them with a quiet nod and said, "It's yours, however far you want to go with it." She stared at the dirt for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and sank the trowel into the soil. By noon, the twins had joined her. Junie, barefoot and uninhibited, dove into the work like a puppy in spring mud, flinging handfuls of weeds behind her. Lyra worked more carefully, removing each root with quiet focus. Her lips pressed together like she was deciphering a puzzle. Cassian watched from the porch steps, a book in his lap, pretending not to be interested. But every so often, his eyes would drift back to the garden. And once, when Junie screamed after touching a worm, he ran down instinctively before catching himself and muttering, "It won't bite it. Doesn't have a mouth." Isolde laughed. She hadn't heard her own laughter in months, maybe longer. Later, as Jake passed through the field with a toolbox, he paused to watch the little scene. The sight of them, muddy and bent over roots, Isolde's hair pulled back in a scarf, her hands in gloves too big, struck something deep in him. It wasn't the scene of people trying to survive. It was the scene of people trying to live again. "Most folks let that patch go wild," he said as he approached. "Something about the soil refuses to stay dead." Isolde looked up, cheeks flushed with color. "I like that about it." He crouched beside her, digging gently with a hand rake. "Cassian's mom loved this garden. I thought about pulling it up after she passed. Letting it go to seed felt easier than seeing it half alive. But you didn't." No. He glanced sideways at her. Turns out I'm better at letting things grow than letting them go. That evening, as the kids napped, sprawled out on old quilts, Isolde wheeled into the den, where Jake was oiling a lantern. The room smelled of kerosene and leather, and the light caught in the flecks of dust dancing midair. "I found something today," she said softly, holding out a folded piece of paper. Jake set the lantern down. It was in an old notebook of mine, from before. She opened it slowly, revealing a half-finished poem, words smudged with time and maybe tears. He read silently. It was about a garden, about grief, about trying to coax something beautiful from the ash of things once burned. "Did you write this?" he asked. She nodded. "I used to teach high school English. Poetry was my favorite. But I stopped after. Well." Jake handed the paper back. "You should finish it." She blinked. "Why, because someone will need to read it someday." She looked down at the paper, then back up at him. "You really think someone like me has something left to say? I think someone like you has lived enough to say it." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Isolde sat by the fire with a pencil in hand, and her legs wrapped in a quilt. She finished the poem. Not to prove anything. Not even to remember who she used to be, but to honor who she might still become. 3 days passed. The garden began to shift. Rows took shape. Seeds disappeared into soil with whispered hope. Jake repaired the old chicken wire fence. Cassian built a scarecrow out of old flannel and straw. Lyra tied a ribbon around its neck. Isolde wrote a new poem each day, sometimes 2. And with every morning, something inside her grew that she thought had died agency. Purpose. A thread pulling her toward herself. On the 4th morning, the mail arrived. A bundle of circulars and a pale blue envelope with no return address. Isolde opened it on the porch, the wood still cool beneath her wheels. Inside was a single page. A letter. Her eyes scanned it, breath-catching halfway through. Jake, noticing her stillness from the far end of the drive, walked over. "You okay?" She handed him the letter. He read it silently. It was from a man named Elowin, from a legal firm in Boston. He represented the estate of Richard Elowin, who had passed away recently. The letter requested contact from Isolde McLaren regarding a sealed provision in Richard's will pertaining to her daughter Lyra. Jake looked up slowly. Isolde was staring out over the garden, her jaw tight. "I never told him," she said. "Told who Richard? He never knew." Jake didn't push, just stood beside her, the letter still trembling in his hand, as the spring wind stirred the first fragile shoots of green, breaking through the soil. The envelope sat on the mantel for 3 days, unopened now, but not untouched. Isolde had held it countless times, read the return address again and again, as if the name might shift, change, vanish. But it never did. It remained Elowin and Crane, Boston, Massachusetts. Jake didn't ask about it again. He was a man who knew how to give space to things that needed breathing room, but the house could feel it. The silence around the envelope had a shape. It curled through conversations, settled into corners, made the tea taste a little more bitter. On the morning of the 4th day, Isolde sat at the kitchen table, while Jake repaired the loose cabinet hinge. The twins were outside, with Cassian drawing chalk dragons across the porch floorboards. The sound of their laughter rose and fell like wind chimes. She finally spoke. His name was Richard Elowin. Jake paused, screwdriver in hand. "He was different," she said. "Not rich when I met him. Just passionate. Kind. We met at a summer poetry seminar in Vermont. He recited Neruda like it was gospel, and he believed everything could be beautiful if you held it in the right light." Jake set the tool down and quietly sat across from her. "We had a brief affair. I didn't know who he'd become until years later. By then I was married. To someone safe, predictable, a man my parents approved of." Her fingers traced circles on the rim of her coffee mug. I never told Richard about Lyra. I told myself it was to protect her. But really, I think I was ashamed of how small my life became after him. Jake didn't answer right away. He looked out the window watching Lyra sketch something with sidewalk chalk, quiet and focused the way she always was. "She's a good kid," he finally said. "She's more like him than she knows," Isolde whispered. That evening after dinner, Cassian found an old wooden box in the attic while looking for an extension cord. He brought it down, dust clinging to his sleeves. "Thought it might be yours," he said, setting it near the fire. Isolde leaned forward. The box was covered in faded stickers. Vermont, Boston, a poetry quote half peeled off. Her breath caught. She hadn't seen it since before the accident. Inside were things she hadn't remembered missing: an old fountain pen, faded photographs, and tucked between two worn notebooks, a sealed envelope with no stamp. She opened it slowly. It was a letter. Her handwriting, addressed to Richard. She'd written it 7 years ago. The ink was smeared in places as though written through tears. "You once said you wanted a reason to stay still. I have one now. She has your eyes. Her name is Lyra." Isolde closed her eyes. She'd never sent it. Too afraid, too proud, too convinced that telling him would invite chaos into a life she'd tried too hard to keep orderly. She handed it to Jake without a word. He read it slowly, reverently. When he was done, he looked at her, not with judgment, but with something quieter, something kinder. I think he said softly he would have come. Later that night, after the twins had gone to sleep, Isolde sat by the window with the letter from Elowin and Crane. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it again. Jake sat nearby, sharpening an old pocket knife, watching her from the corner of his eye. She read the words aloud this time. Slowly, carefully. A sealed provision in the last will and testament of Richard Elowin, pertaining to a minor believed to be his biological child. Should the identity be confirmed, the child will be named sole beneficiary of the Weston Foundation Trust and receive full inheritance under guardianship terms. A meeting is requested for preliminary documentation and testing. Silence. Then Isolde said I should have told him. Jake nodded, but gently. "You didn't know how. Sometimes that's worse than not wanting to." She folded the letter and set it down. "Do you think she'll hate me for it?" Jake looked at her, his voice low and sure. "Lyra doesn't have hate in her. She has questions. But those don't have to be weapons. They can be keys." Isolde's lips trembled, then steadied. She stared down at her hands that used to write sonnets, braid ponytails, plant bulbs in spring. "I want to do the right thing," she said. "You already are," Jake replied. The next morning they drove into town. The law office was a small building near the courthouse, modest but formal. Jake came inside with her, holding the door open as she wheeled through. Mr. Crane was young, polite, and overly cautious. He offered her tea. She declined. "Yes," she said simply when asked. "Lyra is Richard's daughter. She provided documentation, her medical history, the timeline of her pregnancy, a photograph of Richard from that summer, scanned and printed from the back of her poetry book. Crane said the DNA test would be routine. A cheek swab, results in a week." Isolde nodded, thanked him, and left. In the car she sat, silently staring ahead. Jake broke the silence. "You okay? I don't know what I feel." "Maybe you don't have to feel it all at once," he said. She nodded. "But I want her to have what he left. I want her to know. She came from something more than pain." Jake smiled softly. "She came from you. That's enough." Back at the house, Lyra was in the garden digging tiny holes in a row for seeds Jake had left out. She looked up when Isolde returned, shielding her eyes from the sun. Isolde watched her daughter kneel in the dirt, planting life like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was then she knew this wasn't about money or legacy. It was about finally telling the truth. About opening the letter she never sent, even if it was too late for him to read it. Because Lyra still could. By the time the town's annual lantern night arrived, spring had fully taken root. The air was soft and fragrant with apple blossoms. Children rode bikes down gravel roads. The sun stayed just a little longer each evening, and Jake's garden, Isolde's garden, now had begun to show its first shy green shoots. Life, it seemed, was daring to begin again. Jake hadn't been to the festival in years. Since Marcy passed, celebrations had felt hollow echo chambers of what used to be. But when Cassian casually mentioned it over breakfast, Junie's eyes lit up like someone had flipped a switch. "What's lantern night?" she asked Syrup, clinging to her chin. "It's magic," Cassian said, trying not to smile. Junie gasped. "Do we get to light real lanterns?" "Paper ones," he replied. "We write our wishes on them and let them float in the pond." Isolde looked up from her tea. "That sounds beautiful." Jake glanced at her. She hadn't been out in public since she arrived. Maybe this was the right kind of first step. He cleared his throat. "We could go. All of us, if you'd like." The festival took place on the edge of Willow Pond, just past the edge of town, where the land folded into reeds and cattails. By dusk, families gathered beneath strings of warm yellow bulbs strung between pine trees. Booths offered handmade candles, kettle corn, and lemonade in old mason jars. Children wore flower crowns and ran with paper pinwheels spinning in the breeze. Jake wheeled Isolde down the gravel path, slowly careful over the uneven ground. Her daughters walked ahead hand in hand, wearing second-hand sundresses Cassian had dug out of an attic box, marked Marcy Easter. Somehow they fit. Cassian walked next to them, arms crossed, pretending to be unimpressed. But Jake saw the way he glanced at Lyra when she pointed out the fireflies, or how his expression softened when Junie tugged at his sleeve and offered him a paper lantern. The glow of small things was catching up with them all. At a long wooden table near the water, townsfolk scribbled their wishes on thin slips of rice paper, then glued them to lanterns that would later float like drifting stars across the pond. Jake handed each child a brush and a small pot of ink. Junie drew a picture of a goat wearing sunglasses. Cassian, ever the pragmatist, wrote, "Get better at math." Lyra hesitated, brush poised above the paper. She glanced at her mother. Isolde gave her a small nod. "Write what's in your heart." Lyra pressed the brush to paper and began to write. Slowly, carefully, each stroke exact like a secret she wasn't sure she was ready to tell. Jake caught a glimpse before she folded the paper into her lantern. "I wish I could know where I came from, but I'm grateful for where I've landed." It hit him harder than he expected. He looked at Isolde. She was staring at Lyra, eyes damp, but steady. No regret. Just a mother watching her daughter reach for truth with both hands. Later, as darkness settled like a soft quilt over the crowd, the pond came alive with light. Lanterns were lit, each one cradling a hope, a grief, a secret. One by one, they were placed on the water and gently pushed out. The surface shimmered golden petals drifting into the unknown. Jake lit Isolde's lantern for her, then knelt beside her. "What did you write?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "That I hope I'm still allowed to bloom." He stared at her for a long moment. The firelight brushed across her cheekbones, danced in her eyes. She looked different now than she had weeks ago. Not healed, but open, alive. "I think you already have," he said. As the last lanterns floated out, the mayor offered a short speech, something about tradition and community, and remembering those we've lost. Jake barely heard it. Isolde reached over and gently touched his arm. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For letting us stay." He looked down at her hand, her fingers fragile but firm. "I didn't let you," he said softly. "You grew into the place that was already yours." She exhaled a breath, caught between relief and something deeper. "You make it easy to believe in second chances." He paused. "It's not easy, but it's possible." They stood there in silence, watching the last of the lanterns disappear into the dark, a constellation of what-ifs and maybes floating into the future. Back at the house, Junie fell asleep in the truck, clutching her goat lantern like treasure. Cassian carried her inside without complaint. Lyra walked beside Isolde, holding her mother's hand the whole way up the ramp. Inside, Jake started the kettle. "I have something for you," he told Isolde, handing her a small parcel wrapped in old newspaper. She opened it slowly. It was a leather-bound journal, worn but unused. The inscription inside read, "The story isn't over yet." Her hand trembled as she traced the words. "Thank you," she said. Voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded. "You've got more to write." That night, as the children slept, and the house breathed quietly around them, Isolde sat in the armchair by the window. Outside, moonlight stretched across the garden rows, silvering the edges of young green. She opened the journal and wrote the first line of a new poem. Not about Richard, not even about loss, but about beginning again. The letter came with no fanfare, just a tap of tires on gravel, the creak of a mailbox, and the low hum of a car retreating down the long dirt drive. Cassian found the envelope when he went to retrieve the farm catalog Jake had been waiting on. He stared at the return address, Elowin and Crane, Estate Law Group, Boston, MA. Then, without a word, he walked it inside and laid it on the kitchen table beside a still warm cup of coffee. Jake spotted it first. He was helping Lyra measure garden rows with a homemade ruler, one of Marcy's old yardsticks, still bearing teeth marks from Cassian's toddler years. But when he saw the envelope, everything inside him went still. Isolde came in from the porch, wiping her hands on a towel. Her face paled as she spotted the seal. Jake said nothing. He just handed it to her. She opened it slowly, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. This time it wasn't just a letter. It was a formal notice. A legal representative from Elowin and Crane would be visiting in person within 48 hours to conduct preliminary interviews and begin documentation, and confirm the intent of the decedent regarding minor child Lyra McLaren, believed to be the sole biological heir to the Weston Trust. There was also a name at the bottom, Grayson Hartley Escort. He arrived the next morning, exactly on time. Jake had just come back from hauling feed into the barn when the black sedan turned up the lane, shiny, sleek, and so deeply out of place that even the goats seemed offended. The man who stepped out was tall, mid-30s, and crisp in a slate-gray suit that looked like it cost more than Jake's monthly mortgage. His shoes didn't have a speck of dirt on them. He carried a leather briefcase and a clipboard and wore an expression of polite indifference. Jake met him halfway. "Mr. Rowan," the man asked. "That's me. I'm Grayson Hartley. May I speak with Ms. Isolde McLaren?" Jake nodded once. "She's expecting you." They sat in the living room. The sun filtered through lace curtains, casting faint shadows on the floor. Grayson took the chair nearest the fireplace, opened his briefcase, and laid out folders as if preparing to dissect a patient. Isolde sat across from him, spine straight, chin high, legs still, and folded beneath a knitted blanket. Lyra sat beside her, clutching a stuffed rabbit in one hand and her mother's in the other. Jake stood quietly near the doorway, arms crossed, not guarding exactly, but present. Always present. Grayson began without fanfare. Per the terms of Richard Elowin's sealed directive filed posthumously and corroborated with attached medical records and timeline notes, your daughter Lyra has been identified as the sole heir to the Weston Philanthropic Trust, valued at approximately $34 million. Cassian let out a low whistle from the hallway. Grayson continued. There is no contest, no other claimants, no surviving spouse or acknowledged children. You, Ms. McLaren, were never legally married to Mr. Elowen, but your history has been cross-verified. The trustees require only a formal DNA match to finalize the process. Isolde blinked slowly. And what happens after that? Grayson's smile was practiced. Lyra would be legally recognized as his heir. The foundation would assume educational, financial, and developmental responsibility. Wait, Jake interrupted, stepping forward slightly. Are you saying she'd be taken from her mother? Grayson hesitated, a flicker of discomfort passing through his composure. Not removed, but relocated, ideally to Boston under the supervision of a court-appointed guardian until a long-term plan is established. Isolde's voice was quiet, but steel-edged. And who makes that plan? The trustees, Grayson replied, with input from child welfare experts, legal counsel, and of course the best interests of the child. Jake scoffed. That child doesn't need a legal board. She needs a bedtime story and a hand to hold when she has nightmares. Lyra looked up at her mother, eyes wide like she was trying to decide whether to cry or be brave. I don't want to leave, she whispered. Grayson cleared his throat. It's not about want, Ms. McLaren. It's about legacy. Opportunity. No, Isolde said. Her voice was soft, but the room fell completely silent at the finality in it. No, I won't sign anything today, or tomorrow, or until someone shows me how $34 million can replace a mother. That night, after Grayson had left with a polite thank you and an unspoken threat of follow-up, Isolde stood alone in the garden. The stars were out, and the dirt beneath her wheelchair smelled of spring rain. Jake came to her without needing to be asked. I thought this was over, she said. I thought just telling the truth would be enough. Jake crouched beside her. Truth's a seed, he said, but you still have to protect it while it grows. She looked at him, eyes raw but clear. She's not just his child. She's mine. She's yours first, he said. Always. They didn't need more than that. Inside the house, Lyra sat at the kitchen table, her journal open. Cassian sat across from her legs, stretched out, chewing on a pencil. Are you scared? He asked. Lyra thought for a moment. Yes, she said, but not about the money. What then? That they'll try to decide who I am before I know for myself. Cassian nodded slowly. I think who you are is pretty great already. Lyra smiled, a small, shy thing. But in the quiet, it felt like a revolution. The next morning arrived heavy with silence. It wasn't the calm kind that came after a long rain or before a snowstorm. It was the taut kind, the silence of held breath of too many thoughts, crowding into a room that hadn't made space for them yet. Lyra hadn't eaten her breakfast. Junie, sensing something unspoken, quietly offered her the last strawberry. Lyra shook her head, eyes still on her plate. Cassian sat stiffly beside them, trying to make normal happen by sheer force of will. But even he knew, when a lawyer in a suit walks into your kitchen and says your sister might be taken away, it breaks something. Isolde stood at the sink, her back to the room. She was washing an already clean dish with the focus of someone trying not to cry. Jake dried his hands and said quietly, "We should talk." Isolde didn't move. Later. Jake stepped closer. There might not be a later. She turned to him. Not angry. Just worn. I'm trying to hold it together. You don't have to hold it alone. I'm her mother, Jake. It's my job to protect her. He nodded. And you're doing it. But you don't have to do it like this. She looked away. Maybe if I hadn't lied. If I'd told Richard the truth when I had the chance. Jake leaned against the counter. Then what you'd be living in Boston. In a townhouse with a staff and security. That's not who Lyra is. She could have had more. Jake's voice lowered. She already has more. Because she has you. That afternoon, a letter arrived from the trustees. Formal. Distant. Adorned with phrases like legal obligations and failure to comply may result in court-appointed intervention. Jake read it aloud, then folded it carefully and set it on the table. Isolde stared at it. They think they know what's best. They don't know her, Jake said. Junie from her spot on the couch asked softly, "Are they going to take Lyra?" Isolde opened her mouth, but Lyra answered first. "I'm not going," she said. Her voice was small but unshaking. Jake turned to her gently. "Sweetheart, I said I'm not going. I don't care if he was my real dad. This is my real family." Isolde reached for her, but Lyra stepped outside, slamming the screen door behind her. The divide had formed, and no one quite knew how to cross it. That evening, Isolde sat in the sunroom staring out at the garden. The soil was dark and rich now, rose carved and ready. It should have brought peace. But all she could think about was the letter, and the weight of the past catching up to her. Jake entered without a word and handed her a mug of chamomile tea. "I'm not good at this," she said. "At what?" "Being strong." He sat across from her, elbows on knees. "Then don't be strong. Be honest." She looked at him, weary. "What if I lose her?" Jake leaned in. "Then let her see you fight." Later that night, Jake found Cassian in the barn, pretending to adjust the chain on his bike. "You okay?" Cassian didn't look up. "I don't get it. Why can't they just leave us alone?" Jake walked over, crouched beside him. "Because people with power think they're entitled to shape the world the way they see it, even if it breaks the things they don't understand." Cassian was quiet for a while. "Then she's like my sister now." Jake put a hand on his shoulder. "She is." Meanwhile, in the quiet of the upstairs room, Lyra opened her journal. She had started writing again. Slowly at first. Bits of poems. Phrases like puzzle pieces. Things she couldn't say out loud. That night she wrote, "I'm not made of marble. I don't need a pedestal. I just need a place to plant my feet and hands to catch me when I fall." Then she folded the page and placed it on her nightstand, just in case she needed to remember who she was in the morning. The following day, Isolde made her decision. She called Grayson Hartley and told him she would not be sending Lyra to Boston, that she was prepared to submit DNA verification, but would challenge any attempt to separate her daughter from the only home she'd ever known. Grayson responded coolly, "You understand this may escalate." "I understand everything now," Isolde replied. "And I'm not afraid of courts. I've already stood trial in my own guilt for years. I'm not leaving the bench until someone hears me speak." That evening, Jake found a stack of envelopes on the kitchen table. Letters from Isolde, some to her daughters. One to Jake, one to Richard. All written by hand, each word deliberate, as if by writing she could finally claim the truth she had been too afraid to say aloud. Jake read his quietly. "You opened your door to 3 strangers without asking for anything in return. But what you gave us wasn't shelter. It was belonging. And that is the rarest kind of love." He folded the letter and placed it in his breast pocket. Some things were worth carrying close to the heart. The morning the court date was set, it rained for the first time in weeks. Not a light drizzle, but a full-bodied, unapologetic spring storm that turned the drive into slush and rattled the porch screen like it was trying to get in. Jake stood by the window mug in hand, watching the clouds hurl themselves against the horizon. He didn't say anything at first, but the tightness in his jaw gave him away. Behind him, Isolde sat at the table with her arms crossed, tightly, her eyes locked on the official notice from the Montana Family Court. The date was printed in bold at the top. Monday, 10:00 a.m. Petition to evaluate minor custody and placement, Lyra McLaren. She hadn't told Lyra yet. Jake turned to her. "You have to tell her." Isolde nodded slowly. "I know. She deserves to hear it from you. I wanted one more day. One more breakfast without a weight on it." Jake walked over, knelt beside her chair. His hand found hers firm and steady. "She'll carry it better if she knows you trust her with it." That afternoon, Isolde wheeled herself into the sunroom where Lyra was drawing. The girl looked up, hopeful. But one glance at her mother's face told her everything. "It's about the letter, isn't it?" Lyra said softly. Isolde nodded. "There's a court hearing. They want to decide where you belong." "I already know where I belong." Tears sprang to Isolde's eyes. "I know, sweetheart. But they don't. Not yet. Do I get a say? You'll have a voice, Jake and I. We're going to fight this, but it may take time. And strength." Lyra didn't cry. She looked down at her drawing, a half-finished garden blooming in bright oranges and greens. Then she carefully tore the page from her sketchbook, folded it twice, and handed it to her mother. "Take this with you, so the judge can see what I see." 2 days later, they arrived at the courthouse just before 10. The building was small, brick-faced, with a flag flapping half-mast under a steel-gray sky. Jake wore his best flannel under a borrowed blazer. Isolde wore navy clean, neat, dignified. Lyra held Junie's hand so tightly their knuckles turned white. Grayson Hartley met them in the hallway with a neutral expression. "You understand this is a closed proceeding," he said. "Just the judge, legal counsel, and immediate parties. No gallery." Jake nodded. "Understood." Lyra looked up. "Will I be alone?" "No," Isolde said firmly. "I'll be right there." Grayson looked hesitant. "The court prefers a guardian ad litem. She's not walking in without her mother." Jake cut in. The man in the suit paused, then relented with a brief nod. Inside the hearing room, Judge Miriam Talbot presided behind a desk that had seen better decades. She was in her early 70s, silver-haired, with eyes that scanned like an X-ray, but moved like velvet. Isolde spoke first. She told her story plainly, without melodrama, without excuse. About Vermont. About Richard. About the letter that never came. About how she had run from wealth and secrecy into the arms of a smaller, harder life. "I did not come here today to fight for money," she said. "I came to fight for my daughter's right to stay in a home where she is known, not just inherited." Then Jake stood. He spoke not as a lawyer, but as a man who had lost before and learned what it meant to value what remained. "She doesn't need a trust fund. She needs roots," he said. "She needs to know that what's broken can still be mended." Judge Talbot looked at Lyra. "Do you want to say something, sweetheart?" Lyra stepped forward, her chin lifted just high enough to catch the light. "I don't remember my father. I only know stories. But I know my mom. I know Mr. Jake. I know Cassian and Junie. They're my real life." She pulled the folded sketch from her pocket, held it up. "This is our garden. I helped plant it. It's real. That's what I want." The judge took a long time reading her notes, then looked up. "Your daughter is articulate," she said to Isolde. "Brave, too." Isolde held her breath. "There's no law that can dictate love, but there are laws about legacy. So here's what I'm willing to do." She turned to Grayson. "The trust may remain intact. The foundation may retain oversight. But guardianship will not transfer. The child remains with her mother in her current residence under conditional community review. The Weston name will be honored, but not at the cost of this child's heart." A pause. Case closed. Outside the courthouse, the sky had begun to clear. A single shaft of light split the clouds like a quiet hallelujah. Isolde sat motionless for a moment on the steps. Then Lyra ran to her and hugged her with the kind of strength that made pain worth it. Jake stood beside them, hands in his pockets, tears unapologetically gathering in his eyes. Cassian smirked from behind. "Well," he said, "guess we're stuck with each other now." Junie grinned. "You were always stuck." That night back at the house, the garden glowed in moonlight. Jake poured a quiet glass of sweet tea and joined Isolde on the porch. "No fireworks," she said. "Nope," Jake replied. "Just peace." She looked at him. "You're part of this family, you know." He nodded, almost shy. "I think I've been waiting for someone to tell me that." She reached out, took his hand, and for once, there was no silence to break only the gentle hum of belonging. Spring returned with an earnestness that made the memory of winter seem like a bad dream. The days grew longer, the nights warmer. The sharp scent of pine gave way to lilacs and tilled earth. On the edge of Jake's property, just beyond the fence, where the old garden had bloomed again, something new began to take shape. It started with a tree. Jake and Cassian planted it one morning beneath a rising sun, the kind that breaks gently through clouds, like an old friend arriving early for coffee. It was a dwarf apple tree, no taller than Cassian's shoulder, gifted by the county co-op, with a handwritten note tucked into the roots. "To honor new beginnings, plant something that gives." Isolde watched from the porch, a steaming mug of tea between her hands, the soft clink of metal from Jake's shovel, a steady rhythm in the background. "What are they calling it?" she asked, when Cassian came bounding up the porch steps. "The Giving Orchard," he said proudly. "Jake's idea." Isolde raised an eyebrow at Jake, who shrugged, brushing dirt from his gloves. "We've got more land than we need. Figured it was time it gave something back." The idea bloomed faster than the orchard itself. At first it was just one or two local families, who came mothers with tired eyes and children clinging to donated toys. A woman named Luan brought her 4-year-old after leaving a husband who hadn't known gentleness in 10 years. Another woman, Rosa, arrived with twin toddlers and a story no one asked her to explain. Isolde met them on the porch with blankets and hot cocoa. No questions. No pity. Just space. Jake offered work in the garden repairs around the barn and rides to town when needed. Cassian taught the kids how to patch bicycle tires and roast marshmallows without lighting their eyebrows on fire. They didn't call it a shelter. They called it Lantern Haven, named after the night Lyra's wish had lit up the pond. The orchard grew. Jake added cherry and pear trees along the fence line, each with a small wooden marker, bearing a name or word, carved by hand. Grace. Courage. Begin again. Marcy. Isolde wheeled between them one afternoon, Lyra beside her, running her fingers across the carvings. "Why Marcy?" Lyra asked. Jake, kneeling nearby, paused. She was Cassian's mother. "My wife. Does it feel weird, having new people here?" "Now?" Lyra asked softly. Jake stood, looked out across the rows of saplings. "No, I think it's what she would have wanted, for this place to grow again." He turned to Isolde, his eyes steady. "I think healing isn't about forgetting who we've lost. It's about giving the love that used to have nowhere to go. Somewhere to land." Isolde began writing again. Not just poetry, but essays, letters, pieces about motherhood and disability, and the quiet resilience that doesn't fit into newspaper headlines. One of her essays was picked up by a regional magazine, then another by a parenting column. When the editor called and asked if she'd be willing to write a monthly piece called Wheelhouse Notes from a Moving Chair, she laughed out loud. "It's a terrible pun," she said. "It's exactly why people will read it," Jake replied. So she said, "Yes." And every month, her voice reached hundreds, sometimes thousands of readers. One piece about helping Junie plant carrots, went modestly viral, with hundreds of comments like, "You helped me get out of bed this morning. You reminded me that broken isn't the same as finished." She didn't know what to do with praise, so she did what she always had. She turned it into something useful. One Saturday afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up the drive. Jake met the driver with a puzzled look until the man handed over a stack of flat-packed lumber and a receipt bearing the Weston Foundation logo. The note attached was simple, "For Lantern Haven. Thank you for honoring what he never got to say out loud. Eulalia Elowin." Inside the package was a pergola kit, a full set of picnic tables, and materials to build a small greenhouse. Jake showed Isolde the note, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Finally, Isolde whispered, "He didn't forget." "No," Jake said, "and neither will we." That evening, they held a cookout. Nothing fancy, just burgers on the grill, lemonade in mason jars, kids chasing each other between the trees, the hum of old country songs spilling from a radio perched on the porch railing. Isolde sat near the orchard, watching the sun slip low and gold across the horizon. Jake pulled up a chair beside her. "You ever think we'd end up here?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I think we were always headed this way." Jake nodded. Funny how the worst day of your life can drop you on the road that saves you. She turned to look at him. "You saved us, Jake." His voice dropped, tender and firm. "No, Isolde. You saved yourselves." "I just opened a door." She reached for his hand. He didn't hesitate. And under the arching branches of a tree that hadn't yet borne fruit, they sat in silence, the kind that doesn't break, because it doesn't have to. It was the kind of day that smelled like apples and pine needles. Late summer was beginning to fade into gold around the edges, and the orchard was finally offering its first true harvest. Small, imperfect apples blushed with red, and still tart fell into the hands of children who didn't care that they weren't store perfect. At Lantern Haven, nothing needed to be perfect. Only real. Isolde was in the sunroom, her laptop open beside a mug of cooling tea, working on a new essay titled "The Strength in Staying." She paused mid-sentence when she saw the car. It was a pale blue station wagon, the kind rarely seen outside of old movies or church parking lots. Clean, but not new. Purposeful. At the wheel sat a woman in her 70s dressed in a navy blouse, hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. She parked, looked once toward the orchard, and stepped out with the grace of someone used to being watched. Isolde met her at the porch ramp. "I'm looking for Isolde McLaren," the woman said gently. "You found her." The woman extended a hand, gloved and steady. "My name is Grace Elowin." Isolde's breath caught in her throat. "You're Richard's sister." "Yes. I hope you don't mind me coming without notice." "No," Isolde said quickly. "Not at all. Please, come in." They sat in the kitchen, where Jake had just finished slicing apples for a pie. Cassian, sensing the shift in the room, ushered the younger kids outside without needing to be told. Grace took in the room slowly, her eyes resting briefly on the framed photos along the mantel, the mismatched chairs, the crooked art made by children's hands. "This place. It has a pulse," she said softly. Isolde nodded. "It's more alive than anywhere I've been in years." Grace smiled. He would have loved that. There was a pause. "Did Richard?" Isolde began, then stopped. "Did he ever talk about me?" Grace looked down at her gloved hands. "Not by name. But he never stopped writing about someone who made him believe in poetry again. Someone who once read Frost with her eyes closed. He had journals, dozens. I read them after he passed. You were everywhere." Isolde bit her lip, emotion rising uninvited. "I wanted to tell him. About Lyra, I know Grace said. And I believe he knew. Not the facts, maybe, but the feeling. The ache of unfinished things. She reached into her bag and pulled out a weathered leather notebook tied with a faded ribbon. This was the last one he wrote in. I thought, maybe it belongs here. Isolde took it gently, as if it might disappear. She opened it to a random page. If I had a second chance, I would go west. Not for the business, not for the land, but to find the name I was never brave enough to say out loud. Tears slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe them away. Later, they walked the orchard together. Grace moved slowly but without a cane, her gaze taking in the trees, the names etched into markers, the rows of vegetables planted by hands both small and calloused. When she reached the tree marked Marcy, she paused. Your wife, she asked Jake. He nodded. She must have been remarkable. She was, Jake said. But so are the women here now. Grace touched the marker lightly. Then I'm glad her name is among them. They reached a new row unmarked for now. Jake gestured to a small tree, freshly planted, its leaves trembling under the weight of wind and newness. We were going to name it after Lyra, he said. But maybe. Isolde looked at Grace. Grace. Would that be all right? Grace blinked, lips parting slightly. You'd do that? Jake smiled. You brought back a part of Richard we thought was gone. That deserves roots. Grace looked away, briefly steadying herself. Then yes, I'd be honored. That evening, the house was full of quiet music and soft voices. Junie braided Cassian's hair, while he pretended not to care. Lyra read to Grace from her latest journal entry, something about honeybees and hope, and the way things find their way home. Isolde sat beside Jake on the porch swing, the last pages of Richard's notebook resting on her lap. He never stopped looking for something real, she whispered. You gave it to him once, Jake said. Now you're giving it to others. She turned to him. I don't think I would have found this version of myself without you. He looked at her for a long moment. You were always her. You just needed someone to hold the mirror steady. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't need to. The swing rocked, slowly creaking in rhythm with the quiet below. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Isolde sat alone in the sunroom and lit a single candle beside the journal Grace had given her. She flipped to the last page. There, in Richard's familiar handwriting, was a line that didn't ask to be profound, but was. If love is a legacy, let it be the kind that keeps growing after we're gone. She closed the book, then opened her laptop, and began to write again. Not to explain the past, but to give someone else the courage to choose love in the face of loss. Autumn crept in like an old friend, familiar and unhurried. The days grew shorter, but the light softened in a way that made every shadow feel earned. Apples blushed deeper on the branches. The garden gave one last burst of color, bright marigolds, stubborn squash, wild basil clinging to its final breath of sun. Jake stood at the edge of the orchard one morning, coffee in hand, watching the mist drift low across the ground, like memory. Behind him, the house was waking slowly, the sound of a screen door creaking open, Cassian groaning about chores, Junie singing off-key in the hallway, Lyra tapping her pencil against the kitchen table, Isolde laughing at something Jake had forgotten to fix weeks ago. There was peace in the imperfection, and after years of scraping through survival, Jake had learned peace wasn't silent. It was sound, softened by belonging. Lantern Haven had grown, not just in trees and tomatoes, but in people. What started as a quiet act of kindness had become something steadier, a place where women who had nowhere else to go arrived with trembling voices and left with garden dirt under their nails and courage stitched into their skin. Jake and Isolde didn't call themselves founders. They just said they'd made space, and space, it turned out, could change a life. One Sunday, as the last of the corn was pulled and the orchard shimmered in its bronze glow, the family held what they now called Founders' Day. It wasn't official. There were no speeches. Just food. Shared under the pergola, Grace Elowin had helped sponsor laughter that ran like water through the orchard rows, and stories passed around like warm bread. Isolde wore a deep green sweater and a scarf Cassian had picked out because you're practically famous now, he said, holding up a local magazine with her latest column. She'd titled it, The Road Between Us. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and long, Jake sat beside her on the porch. Swing boots scuffed and shirt sleeves rolled up. His hand smelled of cedar and earth. They didn't speak at first. They never needed to rush the quiet. Finally, Isolde broke the stillness. Do you remember the first thing you said to me? At the gas station, Jake smiled without looking at her. Something smooth, no doubt. You said, "You look like someone who's had enough doors closed today. I figured maybe one should open." He nodded. Still true. She turned to face him fully, now her expression gentle but unwavering. I never asked for this. I never expected love again. Not like this. Not slow and rooted and full of things we planned together. Jake didn't speak, but his hand found hers. I want you to know, she continued, that I never would have written that chapter of my life without you holding the page steady. Jake looked at her eyes glassed with something he didn't bother hiding. And I never would have known the best part of mine was still ahead, he said. Then, as the wind rustled through the apple leaves, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny velvet pouch. Isolde blinked. What? It's not a ring, he said quickly. Not yet. But it's a key. He opened the pouch and poured out a small hand-forged brass key. I built a door in the workshop, he explained. A new one. Just for us. Not to lock anything away, but to say, this is ours. She took the key in her palm and closed her fingers around it. And in that quiet gesture, without declarations or ceremony, a life was chosen. As night fell, the family gathered by the fire pit behind the house. Cassian roasted marshmallows. Junie told a dramatic, clearly improvised story about a talking chicken who saved a goat from alien pirates. Lyra read aloud from her journal, her voice confident now, no longer asking permission to be heard. Then she paused and said, I have a surprise. From her jacket she pulled a folded piece of paper. It was an official letter from the Elowin Foundation. I've been writing them, she said. About Lantern Haven. About what it really means. She unfolded the letter. The board has unanimously agreed to allocate an annual grant to support Lantern Haven as a rural women's resource hub to be managed locally. The mission is clear: empower by restoring dignity. We believe it already is. Jake whistled low. That's my girl. Isolde kissed Lyra's hand, holding back tears. That's our girl. Lyra looked at them all. I just thought, if love built this, maybe love should lead it. Later, as the fire faded and the stars stitched themselves across the sky, Jake and Isolde sat with their legs touching the embers, warming their feet. This Jake said, gesturing to the orchard, the laughter echoing from the house, the full quiet between them. This isn't just a place. No, Isolde said, leaning her head on his shoulder. It's a promise. He looked down the long dirt road leading away from the property, the same road where their story had begun, with a woman cast out, and a man who didn't ask why before offering warmth. That road, once narrow and empty, was now full of return trips of visitors of life. Do you think we'll keep growing? She asked, eyes closed. Jake smiled. Only thing we've ever done right. And as they sat in the hush between what was and what would be, the road stretched onward, not a line between them, but the path they chose to walk together. And maybe, just maybe, the road between us isn't as long as we think when someone's willing to walk it with you. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and share your corner of the world with us. This little community is growing, and your voice matters here. And if you enjoy stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of the quiet miracles still unfolding around us, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just an open door always here when you need it. Thank you truly for spending your time with this story. From my heart to yours, be well, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next one.